I'm Jo Wright, and this is the Coaching Culture Podcast, where we discuss how to make work better. Hello and welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast. Today I am joined by a fabulous guest, somebody who is an expert in psychological safety, somebody who I came across only recently and felt fascinated and drawn to interview on today's podcast because I think we have a lot in common. We have a passion for people, coaching conversations, and how we can make the work better, how we can make workplaces better for organisations. But today the topic is psychological safety, and I'm delighted to introduce Stephan Wiedner. Stephan, hello, welcome to today's podcast.
Jo, thank you for having me. I'm excited.
And Stephan, you're over in somewhere near Vancouver in Canada, so we've got a bit of a time delay on our system, but that's all. It's morning to you and good afternoon to me. So we're on this. We've somehow found each other from across the oceans, but here we are today to have a really good conversation. So, Stephan, well, not only psychological safety, you've just told me you also focus very much on health and safety, but we might get into that because I'm going to ask you more about yourself and your backstory. So for the listeners, for their benefit, their interest, tell us a bit about yourself and your story, because I think you've got a really interesting story to share.
Well, I'll say what's first top of mind, because we were just talking about I'm a volunteer firefighter in my little local community. So I live in a smaller community, about 10 minutes out of a bigger city center and 15 minutes drive. And we're about 2,000 people. And so we have a volunteer department. We don't have a full-time career department. So that's something I've taken on in the last, I think it's been about 7 years now. So that's one of the things I do. And it's also a really interesting playground for me to look at psychological safety in that particular lens, right? Because psychological safety is everywhere. And in particular, in an environment where there's life and death at risk. So when we're responding to calls, we're mostly dealing with people's worst days. And we have to operate as a team in a very high functioning, high stress environment. So that requires psychological safety. And so it's a fun little playground for me to see the dynamics and all the different players. We're a team of really different people. We have women and men and old and young and a real variety of people from different professional backgrounds. And so I think it's really fascinating playground. And I love this concept of psychological safety and how teams work together. It's always been a real interest to me. It started probably back in my university days. I studied business and commerce. And the courses that I just loved the most were organizational behavior and IO psych and these types of courses. Finance, whatever, accounting, whatever, marketing, whatever. The things that really got me going were discussions around team performance and organizational efficiency and, this kind of stuff, the softer stuff of business, I guess you can say.
The softer stuff that doesn't often end up being soft at all, does it? Because it's actually super powerful, and literally superpowers. It's super powerful and unbelievably important. And it seems that maybe it'd be really good to share further about who you are and what you do, because you've got a number of interests, a number of businesses, and I know obviously today is psychological safety, but it'd be lovely to understand a bit more about yourself and how you've developed your interest in psychological safety, because I know you've been part of research projects. You've got a wealth of focus in this area and background in this area. So tell us more. Sure.
I'm a little bit modest, so I don't love talking about myself, but I'll share the journey nonetheless, as requested. So I started my first company in 2006 with my business partner, Kurt, and it's a coaching business. And it's what now is newme.com. So we started that company because I had hired a coach and was going into coaching and really curious about it. It seemed like a natural extension from all of my other interests around organizational behavior, et cetera. So I go into that chosen field. And then a friend of mine was visiting another friend of ours, so a mutual friend of ours, Kurt, and he was in London at the time because he was completing his MBA at Cambridge, and he was writing up a business plan. He'd go to the park every day and sit there working on some business plan. And then our mutual friend Jenny, visited him while she was touring through Europe, and she's like, "Whoa, what are you writing your business plan on?" "Oh, it's e-coaching. I'm writing a business plan about e-coaching. We're going to put coaching online, figure that out somehow." So she gets home and she tells me about it and says, "Well, you should talk to Kurt." And Kurt and I we were friends, but we're like, mostly we had mutual friends. Like, we weren't that close, but we knew of each other for sure. And so we had a conversation, and next thing you know, we're starting up this business together. And then that rolled into newme.com, and we have now a network of thousands of coaches all over the world, and we're delivering coaching in organizations. And yeah, it's great work. I love it. And so around 2019 is when I first got introduced to the concept of psychological safety. And
Yeah.
I really glommed onto it right away because in part of our work around coaching, I wanted to demonstrate the efficacy and the ROI of coaching. And
Yeah.
Even though we're really bought into coaching, there's this healthy skepticism that we have. Like, does it work? Why does it work? How does it work? There's a real curiosity there. And we wanted to be able to measure and demonstrate the effectiveness of it to potential clients. And that's when psychological safety came to me, because I realized, oh, this is what we're trying to achieve. When I read about it and learned the definition, I'm like, pretty much every leader we talk to is trying to build psychological safety. I'd never heard that term before, but it's pretty much what they're trying to do. And
Yeah.
so this is great. Now I get to measure it before and after. And so that was the initial seed. And it's blossomed beyond that, because what we realize is, sure, coaching can help facilitate and foster psychological safety, but there's so much more there. There's
Yeah.
so many other ways. And this concept is so much bigger than one-on-one coaching in my mind. So that's how it's really blossomed. And now we're measuring psychological safety in organizations and doing a variety of different things to try to boost psychological safety within organizations.
Now, like you said, back in 2019 was when you first came aware, I suppose, of the term. How would you describe psychological safety? So if somebody sat on here now going, "Oh, I think I know what that means. I've got a few ideas." What would your definition be, so that it's really simple for people to understand exactly what it is?
Yeah. So our definition, the one that we use in our training to support leaders in facilitating and fostering psychological safety, it is the environment where everyone has the courage to speak up,
Yeah.
and the confidence to know they'll be heard.
Brilliant.
So we repeat this over and over again, and that both halves are really important. I think often we think of it as just a speak up culture. So that first part, like the courage to speak up, and I don't think that's enough, because if you look at, say, people that are protesting, do they have that second half? Sure, they have the courage to speak up. They're saying, "We want this, we want that." But do
They're
they
not being.
have the confidence that they're being heard and appreciated and understood? And so that's the second half of our definition of psychological safety, which I think is fairly actionable. I would also feel somewhat remiss if I didn't mention the other definition, the more, I guess, clinical definition. I don't know if clinical is the right word, but academic definition by Amy Edmondson. So she's the individual that is really leading the research, and she's the thought leader in this space. And her definition is that psychological safety is a belief that within your team or your work environment, you can speak up, you can say what's on your mind, you can admit mistakes, and you can do all of this without the fear of reprimand, without the fear of some sort of negative social consequence. So those social consequences might be you get fired, which is not, that is true. That is a consequence that we often think about. But as humans, a consequence we're probably all thinking about more, if not consciously, it's certainly happening subconsciously, is we're worried about things like, well, I don't want to be that person that speaks up and asks a stupid question. Then people think I'm not knowledgeable. So when you were mentioning, Jo, the not wanting to ask a stupid question and prefacing your question
Yeah.
with a statement that it's not a stupid question, it makes me wonder, where did that come from? Like, why did you feel the need to preface your question as such?
Oh, great question. Crikey, I'm getting coaching on my own coaching culture podcast. I can, looking back, I can only imagine it was lack of confidence from my perspective. Um, and whether other people had been shouted down when they'd asked other questions in the past, I can't remember. I don't ever remember feeling that the environment wasn't safe. I remember feeling that I personally wasn't confident in myself. I think it was more about me than the environment.
Mm. Yeah. So I think what that's pointing to is that we're all different,
Yeah.
and your experience of psychological safety is going to be different. And I
Yeah.
do believe that even though you're attributing your sense of psychological safety as something kind of internally, I suspect there are some environments where you felt a lot more safe than others, which we also find. So within an organization, for example, many people are in multiple teams, right? And I think the most common scenario is you have a team manager who is a team. They have their own team, right? They have a set of folks that are their direct reports, and then they also are part of, say, a management team, so where they have a bunch of colleagues and peers that are also managers, and they report to their boss or supervisor, whoever that is. And and so you might feel psychologically safe within your own team and not so much within upper management team, for example. Or maybe it's the other way around. I also know there's some managers that don't feel that psychologically safe within their own team because they feel like, well, because I'm in a position of power, I have to be particularly mindful of what I say. And I tend to have, a wicked sense of humor. And I know I can make comments that are hurtful, even though that they're not intended that way, but it's just my sense of humor. And so now as a manager, I need to be super mindful of it. And so they don't necessarily feel as psychologically safe. So it's really an interesting dynamic, and you really have to explore every individual and every work environment and try to ask the question, what's underlying your sense of psychological safety here?
And what are the things that your research has found then, Stephan? What would you say are the key pointers towards that? Because you've just highlighted there that you may feel different in different teams, and I can visualize that myself. You may have humor, but you've got to understand what somebody else takes as humor may not be funny to them. So there's lots of different dynamics here. And I mean, what you're talking again, I suppose, is it's human behavior, isn't it? And human behavior and dynamics when people come together in a group. So what are the things that you're finding that are the sort of
Yeah,
measures of
well, well,
say?
there's the research, and then there's the anecdotal evidence and observation, and then there's a research study that we're actually doing. So I'll tell you about some of the research that we're looking at. That's really kind of driving some of the lens through which we're looking at psychological safety, and it goes back to the research being done in counseling. And it seems like, why are you looking at? That's weird. What does counseling have to do with business? But I'll tell you why. So in counseling, what we know about counseling is that you have two people typically, or unless there's group counseling, you have two people in a room, and the counselor is helping the other individual. They're facilitating outcomes, right?
Yep.
If I'm the counselor and you're the client, then I want to help you get better outcomes. And in a team environment, in an organization, as the leader, my job is to have a collection of people, and I'm trying to get better results for the group, for the organization, for each of those individuals. And so I think that skills that are required, there's got to be some parallel there. And so when we look at the research that's being done in counseling, there's really good researchers that have asked that question, like, what makes an effective counselor? And when you look at all the different types of counselors that are out there, because there's a whole bunch of different ones with different philosophical backgrounds and methodologies that they've trained under, and there's always good ones and bad ones, no matter what type of counselor you're looking at, there's always good ones and bad ones, right? So what's common among all the good ones? And they've identified these things called common factors, or it's basically their interpersonal skills. And a very clever researcher by the name of Tim Anderson developed an assessment to measure these interpersonal skills. And at the core of these interpersonal skills, we believe, is number one, empathy, and number two, interpersonal responsiveness. This is the really critical component. So yes, we always want to start with empathy, because if you're going to lead a team, you need to be able to be willing to put yourself in the other people's shoes to sort of understand and look at the world through their eyes. The more you can do that, the more you can adapt to their needs and desires. And then the second thing is interpersonal responsiveness, noticing that. And what is that? It's the awareness when there's some sort of a rupture, not necessarily between you and someone else, but maybe between team members, and being able to approach it like, hey, I'm noticing something going on here, and being able to do so in a way that opens the dialogue as opposed to shuts it down. And so what we're currently doing then is we've developed our own performance-based assessment to measure these same interpersonal skills, but in a manager as opposed to a counselor. And then we're in the study, which we just got approval by the ethics board. So that's woohoo! Like literally this week on Monday, we got approval by the ethics board that we can move forward with the study as designed. We're going to be measuring the interpersonal skills of a manager and then correlating that with their team's sense of psychological safety. So we're going to have their teams assess psychological safety, and we're going to have the managers assess their interpersonal skills. And then we're going to see if there's a correlation there. And we know that in counseling, those interpersonal skills are predictive of client outcomes. And so our hypothesis is that there is going to be a correlation between interpersonal skills and the sense of psychological safety felt by the team. Now, I've talked to a lot of people about this, and in fact, one of our research sites, the learning and development manager there says, well, duh, like it's so obvious. Do we even have to measure it? Well, I think we do have to measure it. And we know that a manager and a leader, like the team leader, has an outsized influence on psychological safety. We do know that from previous research. And yet we don't know how much, because one other hypothesis is that it's not the level of interpersonal skills of the manager that's really driving the overall psychological safety, but instead the lowest rung on the ladder, if you will. We are all probably familiar of, that one bad apple in the team, and you have that one person who's really challenging. Everything just kind of shuts down. Is maybe that's the more driving factor, is the lowest rung on the ladder, if you will. Don't know. I mean, these are all really good hypotheses, and that's why they're questions that we can answer and get answers through research.
And I can visualize this in terms of what you're describing. So a kind of measuring it sounds fantastic. It sounds a fantastic support for organizations, because we all know that the successful organizations have got psychologically safe teams operating within them. And, they foster a fabulous culture of belonging for people and all the great things that you would expect. But it's interesting what you just said about that one bad apple, or that one person who's kind of throwing things in that may not be helping the team. Then it'd be really interesting to understand kind of what's going on with them. What's causing them to behave like that? What's going on for them? And that's where I suppose the coaching conversations can help, actually really understand what's going on for this person, because and this is where feedback comes in and goes back to your empathy, understanding what's going on for them at this moment in time, because anything could be happening, couldn't they, for them? They may not be a bad apple at all, but they may be being disruptive or causing challenges because of something outside of work, whatever it may be. So this sounds a fascinating subject, and I'd be really interested to hear how you get on with all of this. And whoever laughed at you and said it's obvious, I think it's a really fabulous piece of work that hasn't been done before. So, and that's the key, isn't it? It's like, we all know this, but we're now proving this. more specific
Well,
one.
we're attempting to anyway. We're attempting, and I think what's really what I'm most excited by this research is really the assessing interpersonal skills, and I think it. I mean, we're just standing on the shoulders of giants, right? The previous researcher Tim Anderson, what he did is they identified challenging moments in counseling, and then they had actors act out that scenario. And then they showed those to counselors and said the instructions were fairly basic. It just said, watch this clip of an actual session of what someone might say in a counseling session, and then respond in the way that you feel is most appropriate. And they recorded those responses, and then they codified the responses. So ahead of collecting those responses, they said, okay, here's what we're going to look for. And here's what a 5 out of 5 looks like. And here's what a 1 out of 5 looks like. And they had human coders, and they had high levels of inter-rater reliability. So they made sure everybody was trained, looking for the same thing, et cetera, et cetera. And that is a performance-based assessment, unlike, a self-report. And because interestingly, when they assessed those interpersonal skills, they also used the SSI, which is an assessment for basically empathy, because they thought, well, the core of this is empathy. We really think it's empathy. So then they asked folks, how empathetic are you basically in this assessment? And the empathy scores did not correlate with outcomes, whereas the performance-based assessment scores did. So how someone reacted to these stimulus clips was different from how they said they would, basically, which is not surprising, right? Like everyone, if you ask someone to fill out an assessment about how empathetic they are, I know what the right answer is.
Well, the right answer is the truth.
Yeah. And so I think that's a really clever form of thin slicing. And what's interesting about it is these clips, remember, they're the hard ones, because it's easy to be a good manager when everyone gets along, we're hitting our numbers, things aren't too challenging. It's when you start to have interpersonal conflict, when you're not always in agreement, maybe you have external pressure, right? There's COVID or something other wild and crazy. How then do you manage the team, and can you rise to the occasion? So what we do is we have these engineered scenarios that are really challenging, and we see how people respond. And the idea being those who can rise to the occasion in this simulated, engineered environment are the ones that, by and large, are going to be better performing as managers in the long run.
Wow. So it's a predictive tool, really, to see how, as a manager, this person's going to perform. That is really, really fascinating. And wow, that sounds like gold dust there, because that solves a lot of recruitment challenges. I'm guessing, therefore, it's just a moment in time, because actually things may change for that human being as well, or the manager. So things may change along the way.
That's right, because it's a performance-based task. It's not like personality, which tends to be relatively fixed. And this is the first study where we're looking at correlation. And if we can fast forward a few years, we'll eventually, if we can provide some results there that are meaningful, where there is a correlation there, then the next real phase is to look at causation. And you do causation by saying, can we boost one side and then effectively boost the other, right? Can we boost interpersonal skills and therefore boost psychological safety? That's a lot harder of a study to conduct. And it's an open question still. Like, can we in fact boost these interpersonal skills? I think the belief is yes. And there's a lot of momentum in the counseling world to support these interpersonal skills as being skills that can be improved with practice. And to what extent? That's still an open question. Like we need to answer that.
We need to talk, don't we, in 2 or 3 years' time, and I'll say, come on then, Stephan, show us the results. What's going on? What's happened? Because this sounds fascinating. It really, really does. And actually having that sort of hard evidence, that kind of absolute proof. This is what we think we feel, but let's prove it. I can't get away from the words emotional intelligence popping into my head right now, because you keep talking empathy and interpersonal skills. And when I in my own mind, when I wrap those two together, I'm thinking people who are emotionally intelligent. Have I thrown in a curveball saying that, or do you like to keep them all very separate?
Oh, I definitely think there's something relevant there. One thing we could potentially do too, which would be perhaps an easier study, or once is you could measure the interpersonal skills of the individual and then measure their EQ scores.
Yeah, yeah,
Right? Do
absolutely.
those things correlate, or are they
Yeah,
wildly off? Like, we know that the interpersonal skills and the SSI didn't correlate that strongly. The SSI
yeah.
being basically a measure of empathy, a self-report measure of empathy. And so those didn't intersect. And so I'd be curious, to what extent do these interpersonal skills, the ones that we're measuring and looking for, do they correlate with emotional intelligence? Don't know.
Wow,
That's
this
a great question. Or any other, it'd be interesting to look at. There's various other assessments like the leadership circle or whatever. We can look at
yeah.
a number of these assessments and look at how these two findings correlate, if at all. I don't know.
This is fascinating stuff, and I think it's brilliant that people like yourself are looking into this to really start putting some hard evidence behind, like you said before, the softer skills, when actually they're not really, they're super powerful, aren't they? The super powerful soft skills, and
Well,
actually putting that proof behind it.
yeah, and not even super. Like, I'd say, yeah, sure, they're soft skills and they're superpowers. I would say that they're also measurable, right? That's the beauty. Like, because we can measure them and we can train people to look for these skills, they know what to look for. Then we can train people in being able to improve them. That's our philosophy. That's our approach. Because it's similar to, think of sports. I'm a hockey fan, and I used to watch hockey when I was a kid, and I coached my son's hockey, and now watching the pro game, it's amazing. And I think this is probably true for almost all sports, where the quality of players now compared to 20, 30 years ago, it's night and day. Like, if you
Yeah.
took a pro team today and played against the best team 30 years ago, it wouldn't even be a contest. Not even a
Because
contest.
because we know so much more about psychology, what's driving high performance, all the ingredients. I suppose it's all that, is it?
Well, yeah, I think you're right. We know a lot more. And I think the part that's really moving the needle is, I see it on at the skill level with the kids, is the level of coaching that we're receiving is fascinating, where we're taking this, like, for me growing up as a kid, it was sort of like, all right, let's do some skating, warm up. All right, let's scrimmage. Everything was
Yeah,
just, let's just scrimmage, let's get into a basically simulated game
yeah,
and use some skills, whatever you think are the best. And now it's like, you got all these very specific skating drills and then specific passing drills. And the point is, we're taking all of the skills that you use in a game and breaking them down. And
yeah,
that's what sports does really, really well. Okay, we're going to work on skating. We're going to work on skating forwards. We're going to work on skating backwards. We're going to work on passing on the move, passing while skating backwards. You break down all of these skills and you work on them independently. And then what do you do in a game? In a game, that's where you have to dynamically determine, what skills do I use now? And you're sort of responding in these micro-fractional decision-making process that we have. And the best athletes can make those micro decisions like instantly, and they see the game better than all the other players. And so they're responding in the smartest way possible in that very moment. But they've practiced those skills so much that they don't have to think about executing the skills. Like, they're not thinking about how I'm skating or how I'm moving my body. They're just going to move their body naturally because it's now muscle memory. So we're trying to do that same thing. So we just think of soft skills as like soft skills. Get into a
yeah,
game and just talk, I guess, say stuff.
yeah,
And we're recognizing that we can break that down. We can, okay, what are you doing? For example, one of the very first skills we teach is reflecting content. What does
yeah,
reflecting content mean? Someone says something, you paraphrase back what they just said. Try to use slightly different words so you're not parroting what they're saying. And if they speak for 1 minute, try to keep your response to 30, 20 seconds, right? If they speak for a minute and you speak for 2, you're not paraphrasing. You're not reflecting content. You're adding more to it.
Yeah.
So, and we do that all the time. And yet often we will do it poorly. And so that's just one skill. And we start with that one. Then we go to reflecting feeling. What is that? Well, if someone's communicating to you, there's some sort of emotion there. So just reflect back to them. Oh, I see you're struggling with this and that. I can tell there's probably some frustration there. Did I get that right? Right? That's reflecting feelings. And maybe I get it wrong. And you say, no, it's not really frustration. I just feel kind of sad. I feel kind of bummed about it. Oh, okay, perfect. Let's move on. So that's what we're really trying to do, is take all of the skills that we're intuitively using all the time and sharpen them up and make them really explicit so people can practice those skills. And then in a game, they're using them. Game being, real life situation, which we're in all the time.
What's number 3? You said you're working on 3 things. You got reflecting content, reflecting feeling.
The third skill. I mean, there's quite a few skills that we practice, but the third one along those veins, along that vein of content, feeling, the third is process, reflecting process. Right. This is the one that I think is like the superpower for leaders, to be honest.
Yeah. Okay.
So reflecting content, pretty basic. Reflecting feeling, it's a little tougher, right? Especially for people if they're thinking, well, jeepers, as a leader, I don't want to be a therapist. I don't want to have my direct reports put their head on my shoulder and talk to me for an hour. Well, we're not saying that, right? We're not saying you need to become a therapist or counselor. And yet emotions there all the time, good and bad, right? Oh, wow, I see you're really proud of your work. Yeah, I am. High five. Right? Yeah. It just allows you to name what's in the room, and it makes people feel understood and appreciated. That's that second half, right? The courage to speak up and the confidence to know you'll be heard. So reflecting content and feeling has people feel heard, appreciated, understood. And then reflecting process. What is that? That is where, as a leader, often you ever get that feeling you're in a meeting and it's just kind of stuck. You're going around and around.
Yeah,
it's like, oh my goodness, this is not going anywhere. So reflecting process allows you to step outside of the meeting and kind of look at it from the grandstands, if you will.
Yeah.
And that's what we call taking on the bystander role. And as the bystander role, you're adding perspective. So you might say, gosh, I'm noticing that this meeting for the last 20 minutes has felt absolutely draining, and it feels like we're not getting anywhere. It feels really stuck. How can we move forward here?
Brilliant.
So notice how I just reflected process. I reflected what's happening on the field. Because often what happens is people are just sort of stuck in it, and maybe they're noticing it, but they're not saying anything about it. And so this stuckness just kind of perpetuates. And so as a leader, it's really effective to have that mindfulness to step back and just reflect back what you're noticing, not because you're going to fix it, not like you have all the answers, but instead you're just going to shine a light on it. Because I think that's what holds a lot of leaders back, is they don't know how to resolve it, or they'll just say, okay, that's it. I've heard enough. Let's move on. That's not necessarily an effective solution either. So what we want to really encourage leaders to do is embrace that bystand perspective and just reflect what they're noticing and let the team figure it out, right? Like empower the team to kind of go, oh yeah, we are kind of stuck. What's going on here, right? It's allowing them to sort of process what's happening. That's why we call it reflecting process.
And I'm listening to this and thinking, this is absolutely fabulous stuff. And I can't get away from thinking, this is describing somebody who's great at coaching, paraphrasing, reflecting, absorbing and understanding someone's feelings. And then also, being able to take a different perspective and look in on something and kind of team coach the way through. Like you said, let the team come up with the answers. It feels like there's definitely a coaching undertone here in terms of, unless I just see coaching in everything, maybe I do, a coaching undertone in the terms of having those skills to listen and reflect back and observe and look around and just not be so in the detail of that moment, actually being able to take that step back. I'm kind of hearing these are really important skills for absolutely for leaders of teams, and just getting the best out of people and groups. So I totally, that's what I'm hearing, but I don't know whether have I got this sort of absolute coaching bias. I probably have, but there's definitely some similarities here. Definitely some similarities in, how that can help to people opening up and being heard because you're having the words reflected back. But yeah, there you go. I've just self-reflected on myself. Have I got a coaching bias? Probably, but I do see it.
I'd argue that's a really good thing, Jo. You're right. I think a lot of this points towards the coach approach to facilitating outcomes with the team.
Absolutely. But it's interesting to what you said about counsellors and kind of there's obviously the spectrum of kind of different skills, but actually having that level of empathy towards reaching an outcome as well. I tell you what's kind of playing in my mind here a little bit is, what about those team leaders, so senior leaders who don't have the interpersonal skills, who are already so far up the organisational tree, they've missed any of your assessments or measurements along the way, and actually they're just not there. They have, because we have those leaders who are creating environments that aren't psychologically safe. Crikey, I probably just opened another total can of worms, really, when we were probably going to start wrapping it up. I wonder whether we should have Jo and Stephan part 2. What happens when it's not psychologically safe? What goes wrong? What are the indicators? I don't know. I'd love to hear.
Yeah, I mean that points to I'd say our bias here in terms of how we want to improve psychological safety, because I think we certainly see abrasive leaders, or sometimes they're referred to as toxic leaders, right? They exist. They're out there in organizations, and there's all sorts of harm and damage there, even beyond, reduced psychological safety. I think some people feel, harassed and various other forms of harm in the workplace, and that's awful. I obviously don't want that. And what we've noticed, because we've had a number of coaching engagements of this nature where we're working with leaders that are quote unquote toxic or quote unquote abrasive. I prefer the word abrasive over toxic, because toxic kind of implies, well, you're toxic, you have a poison in you kind of thing. And that's that. Whereas abrasive is a little softer, because what we know about abrasive leaders is I might be abrasive for some people, but not everybody. It's not a quality that is solely on me. And so being less abrasive is something you can work on and improve. Whereas I guess toxic feels a little bit more like it's just part of you, so you have to work around it or something. So it's a little bit of it is some semantics and philosophical, but nonetheless, what we notice with most abrasive leaders, not all, but most, is that they don't intend to be hurtful or harmful. It's just, it's the way they've been socialized. It's the way they've been taught. It's the way they think they need to be operating. And they're not aware. So I'd say they lack awareness around the impact that they're having. And so we need to shine a big, bright light on the impact that they're having, and then give them tools to help change their behavior, change how they interact with one another. And some of that is skills, and some of that is just, having a new mindset around what it means to be a leader. Because often what we see with a lot of leaders is they think, well, because I've been promoted, and I've been promoted because I'm really good at my job, and I know I'm technically proficient. And as a leader, I need to have all the answers. As a leader, I'm the smartest person in the room, and I need to make sure everybody knows that.
What we've missed that needs busting right there.
Yeah, right. It's like, well, that's not exactly correct. That is not necessarily the best approach for being a leader. It's not to have all the answers. And that's where, that points to another issue we see around psychological safety, is that leaders feel like, oh, well, if I'm going to ask my people and be curious and ask them all these questions so that they're speaking up, they fear that they have to agree with them. And that's not the case either. We're not saying you need to agree, you need to understand.
Yeah.
Because if we can understand one another, then we can work around the problem or whatever, barriers might be there. It's like, oh, I get it. Oh, I understand. Now I get it. That sensation of, oh, I see where you're coming from. Oh, now we can come up with a much better answer or a better solution that's not maybe compromising, right? Whereas if you're not necessarily understanding one another, maybe there's a compromise where both parties feel a little bit like, I'm not getting exactly what I want. Whereas if you can seek mutual understanding, now we can come up with a third option that no one else considered before.
It's fascinating. I think this topic, I think listening to you, I could have this conversation for hours and hours, because it's such a fascinating, fabulous topic. Organization, people, behaviors, what's happening out there. But I suppose if we were, the things I'm hearing from yourself are, we're all different. So let's acknowledge that. You're definitely telling, we're all different, and therefore what one person perceives as one thing, another person wouldn't. So we've got to be aware and mindful that, we're dealing with lots of individuals here. And actually, raising self-awareness is really important. So actually, however you're going to get that through feedback is probably the best way, is actually let other people tell you that the impact that you're having on them, and actually help people raise their own self-awareness, and actually having the ability to understand others, empathize, and meet on some sort of, or recognize that you've got to meet on that mutual ground to move forward in a group or a team environment. And actually just that, even talking about psychological safety, I think is really powerful. And I think, it's a topic that's been resonating for a number of years, but actually it's growing and growing and growing. And the work that you're doing and the research sounds like it's really going to unlock some nuggets. Well, I certainly hope it will when we speak again in 2 or 3 years, Stephan, to understand where you get to with all of that, because that does sound really, really interesting. Clearly, I don't want to wait for 2 or 3 years to speak again, but let's definitely wait till you get the research and have another podcast conversation. So if you were wanting, for people listening today, whether they're leaders of an organization, whether they're in people teams, whoever they may be, what are the sort of the nuggets that you would want them to go away with today and say, do you know what? If I was giving you some advice on the things that you should do that have the greatest impact, what would that be?
Yeah, there's 2 things I would say. We'll start the first, which is measure psychological safety.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
Just measure it. It's super easy. So it's 7 questions, and you can administer that, and it takes people 3 minutes to answer. So rather than speculate about what level of psychological safety is being experienced in your team or your organization, just measure it. Because that which you can measure, you can change. And so that's the first thing. And recognize that it's not going to be a uniform answer. You're going to get an average score, obviously, but there's going to be a range of responses. You're going to have some folks who feel great and other folks who don't. And what's also really fascinating about that is I just got off a call prior to this one with a woman that filled out the psychological safety assessment. She thought, I think we have pretty good psychological safety. And then she answered the question. She came back and said, oh, we're not doing nearly as well as I thought. She was just answering it on the behalf of the organization. So she's now going to take the next step. She wanted to become familiar with the questions and so on. And she's going to now assess the entire organization, actually get data. But she had a misconception about exactly what psychological safety was. So she had a belief in her mind that it's X, and it was, it's maybe not quite Y, but X modified. And so that's the first thing I would do. And then the second thing is, and this is, maybe feels a little bit more like taking action, is just start to notice, especially if you're a team leader and you have some direct reports, just start to notice what might be causing someone's psychological safety to go down. Notice
Brilliant.
interactions in the team. Notice if people are hesitating to speak up. Maybe they're not saying anything at all. And by the way, what we see with low psychological safety is you might think it's, a really destructive team environment. It's not. A low psychological safety is often characterized as politeness. When everyone just kind of is polite, agreeable, and there's no real pushback. The leader says, let's do X, Y, Z. And everyone says, okay, sounds good, I guess.
Wow. So it's very compliant then.
Yeah. It's that compliance, that agreeableness, that politeness. That is not a psychologically safe environment. So that's a danger sign. So if everybody on your team is just kind of following along with you, there's perhaps not enough sense of psychological safety being invited into the room. So you start to notice why or when people are not speaking up. Why might that happen? And then get curious about it.
That's brilliant. And so, it's everybody's responsibility, isn't it, for psychological safety? It's everybody's, because it can impact the culture massively. It can impact the organizational culture. It can impact individual teams, individuals, mental health, so many things that psychological safety can positively impact, but also if the lack of it, how much the negative impact on the other side of that coin. So thank you so much for our conversation today. Honestly, I could speak to you and listen to you all day. I've really enjoyed it, honestly. It's been fascinating, and I'd love to see some more of the research that comes out. It does sound really interesting. How can our listeners get in contact with you? What's the best way to learn more about yourself, Stephan?
Yeah, I love connecting with folks on LinkedIn. So reach out to me, connect with me there. I think you'll probably put a link in the show notes, I would hope, or just go to LinkedIn and search for my name, Stephan Wiedner. And my LinkedIn URL is linkedin.com/IN/S Wiedner. So SWIEDNER, that being my first initial and last name. And also on our website, so zarango.com/free PSI. So I mentioned measuring psychological safety. If you're a member of a team, I would be delighted to measure the psychological safety. Let's get that measured. I'll provide you with a report. I can even sit down with your team and debrief those results with you a little bit. That, I would say, would be step number one on your journey to embracing and fostering psychological safety in your team. So zarango.com/free PSI. Free PSI. PSI standing for Psychological Safety Index. That's it.
Thank you so much. So they can contact you and they can get freebies from you. This is even more value right to the very end of the podcast. And then I'll say to people in a 2 or 3 years' time, when all the research is published, then it all gets published in his book, because Stephan has got to write about this one day when he's a published author about psychological safety. That's where I want to see you going, Stephan, because this is fabulous content.
Thank you. Appreciate being given this opportunity to speak to your audience and have a conversation, Jo. I'm just delighted to support anybody who's out there who wants to build psychological safety. It's
absolutely
my North Star.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's been really, really interesting and really valuable. And again, for listeners, please do contact Stephan on LinkedIn and look up with www.zarango.com and definitely download and get access to that free gift that you've just been given. That sounds like an absolute must. And again, please tune into more brilliant coaching culture podcasts where you get to hear other fabulous guests. But thank you, Stephan, for now. You've been tremendous. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure, Jo. Thank you.